Hi, I'm Adam Pajoli, and I write a lot of pretty dense philosophical texts that I occasionally like to mix up a bit with some discussion of screen media. Watching great films and TV shows is one of my favorite things to do in life. It's also one of my favorite things to talk about with people. Philosophy is great and all, but it tends to be a bit of a debate usually. Everyone's got their own, or it's just a monologue. If someone doesn't know much about it, so they either have their own opinions, or it's me talking too much and lecturing people, which is feels more comfortable in the written form than just a one-sided conversation. With film and TV, especially if people have seen it, then they get to be like, yeah, oh yeah, and then I can throw philosophy in there, and it's fun. But when people haven't seen what the greatest films and shows that are so important to me, then I end up just talking too much about them anyway and trying to get people to watch them. And one of my favorite shows, The Leftovers, tends to come up in this manner because not many people have seen it. It's widely hailed as one of the best shows of all time, but I don't think people give it a chance. Or if they do, if they start watching it, then it's way too serious and a bit sad at first. But it's, I think, the best show ever made. It's maybe not at the level of The Wire, but The Wire is a bit of a downer, more so than The Leftovers, which actually has what I would call a kind of metamodern, sincere message going on that is crucial to the way that we are modeling our culture and understanding the way meaning is made. The Wire is more of a postmodern TV show. It's probably the quintessential postmodern film and TV shows. Basically, No Country for Old Men, I would say, is the most quintessentially postmodern film, and then The Wire, I think, maybe is the most postmodern TV show because they both have a tragic look on the world. And I think that postmodernism, a lot of reasons people hate it is because it is showing, it is about limits. It's showing the limits of not only certain rules and belief systems like in a traditional tragedy, but all meaning making, how it all has its limits. But they don't necessarily give us a way forward. And a lot of people on the internet especially are into this idea of metamodernism, thinking that postmodernism is too negative and limiting. We need something that's more sincere, but incorporates something of postmodernism and the kind of reflexive, ironic, self-aware mode that people identify with postmodernism. We don't want to get rid of that, but we want something that is self-aware but also sincere. And so various films might correspond to this. Everything Everywhere All at Once is pretty meta-modern in this sense. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing, but it's not my favorite thing. It's a bit too ridiculous sometimes, and there's some real. I like them. I'm writing a book very much about the multiverse and the kind of virtual idea of the virtual worlds and multiple dimensions and all that, and the way that gets worked into both narrative and the way that it's kind of a part of our metaphysical belief system that is kind of fueling a lot of the media and the way that we think and understand the universe right now. So Everything Everywhere All at Once really hit a lot of those points for me, but it's not the best, not my opinion. The Leftovers, however, there's no real multiple realities going on exactly, but there are multiple ways of interpreting reality that are never quite affirmed in any uncomplicated, uncritical way. Like, there will be at some points like this is the way things are, but then a scene will follow it in the show that will give you a different perspective that undermines it. Not just in, it's a common trope or a common like strategy in filmmaking to like show different perspectives and like, whoa, who's right? This is goes. It's most famously done by Kurosawa, probably. But this is not the same thing. It's just different perspectives on an event. Like who had the truth, or is the truth just like the intersection of these different perspectives? This is about like what does anything actually mean in the first place? Not just about takes on what actually happened, but like what do things mean? So even like people can agree, everything, like in the show The Leftovers, if you don't know, I won't give any spoilers, but I'll give you some kind of thematic spoilers that don't give too much away. But the premise, before even the show starts, everybody is in disarray in the world because 3 years prior, 2% of the world just disappeared. And so everybody agrees on that. There's no difference. Like, well, did it really happen? No, it happened. But what does it mean? Well, minor thematic spoiler, the show is not about trying to like tell you what that means or like make you wait for them the revealing of what that actually means. No, the show is about how this is the whole disappearance. It's just a metaphor for death, for the great mystery, the greatest mystery. What is it? And if we don't want to just, it would be dumb if we just said, well, this is what actually happens. This is death, even in esoteric spirituality, even though they often tend to have like definite philosophies about what happens after death. The best of them, anyway, really acknowledge that what happens after death is very much dependent upon the way that you think. And the characters in this show are all responding to death and loss, and often guilt is another major theme of the show, of what their responsibility is for what happens. Do we create our own reality, as the New Agers like to say? And this theme of creating your own reality, it was most sophisticatedly discussed in the Seth books, which I consider to be the most like quintessential postmodern popular metaphysical texts. So the New Age for me is the kind of spiritual metaphysical side of postmodern philosophy, right? There are academic metaphysicians that also might correspond to this. Is basically what people mean by metamodernism. It's not actually a new thing. It's not actually something that's very different from postmodernism. Postmodernism's kind of been, that word's been associated with people like Jacques Derrida, deconstruction, which definitely has a more negative affect and negative critical tone to it. But there are, postmodern philosophy, or post-structural philosophy, as it's probably more properly called. Probably the two biggest figures are Derrida and Deleuze, and Deleuze is not negative at all. I mean, his whole philosophy is a philosophy of affirmation, and he's very much about metaphysics. And he actually draws from, not the Seth books, but his most popular book, written with his co-author Felix Guattari. They wrote a book called A Thousand Plateaus. It references Carlos Castaneda in several places. Carlos Castaneda, along with the Jane Roberts Seth books that I mentioned, I think those are the two most important New Age authors. And I think there's a lot of overlap. And so I tend to think of what people call metamodernism is just the metaphysical side of postmodernism, as opposed to the critical side, which people just call straight up postmodernism. But all these things are just a lot of jargony terms for different sides of our culture. Our culture after the World War II, especially the 1960s, it's all still postmodern. Modern. We're all still struggling with what do things mean, and a lot of our media struggles as well. And so some people think of a return to sincerity and like a rejection of postmodernism and irony and all the negative affect stuff that depresses people, and like wanting more just straightforward storytelling. That could even be considered metamodern, because you can never really just go back. There's still a kind of consciousness of what you're rejecting and what you're leaving behind. But when that consciousness is more obvious, and it's part of the narrative itself, like in The Leftovers, where it is constantly deconstructing all of the meaning and narratives, but at the same time it's affirming something that more postmodern media artifacts do not. The Wire is one of the best shows ever, probably the best. And at the end, the mythic narrative that you get is giving you a vision, a metaphysical vision, if you will, of how things work. But it's tragic in the sense that all attempts and meaning basically fail, and so the overarching meaning is just this cycle of people not being able to really affirm any one particular role or rule. This is a thing in tragedy, right? The rule that a character might follow has its exceptions. It doesn't quite jive with another rule, and there's confusion. There's a confusion and conflation between categories, between the living and the dead, the real and the unreal. No one's quite sure, and that can often lead to tragic circumstances. But the real tragedy is that complexity is too great for people to find their place. And in postmodernism, I think, as a discourse, this was taken to another level, where this was, even in Derrida, there's a metaphysics involved, where he's saying, that there is a structure to this inability for one meaning to really grasp reality, but it's not just a failure. This limitation is built into reality as a kind of positive structure. And so Derrida even isn't purely negative. He's not denying metaphysics. There's a metaphysics of difference in all these postmodern authors, and Gilles Deleuze just takes this to a new level and says, well, yes, there's a structure of difference, but that structure is productive, and it produces it creates forms, and it creates meaning and connections, right? So just because there's no master connector, it doesn't mean things don't connect. And so, Gilles Deleuze especially, everything is connected. Even though, like Jacques Derrida, like deconstruction, the connections are always under erasure. They're always under the domain of the shifting of contextual boundaries, the shifting of connections. So things are connected, but never in a way that can be stabilized into one identity. So difference is always at the heart of everything. And it really, what that means is relations are at the heart of everything. And you see this in a more easy to understand way in the popular version of postmodernism, what I think has been wrongly called the New Age. But there's some aspects of the New Age are dumb, of course, but in people like Carlos Castaneda and Jane Roberts famously, Seth famously says, you create your own reality, and that kind of took on a whole life of its own that I won't go into. But Carlos Castaneda says things a little more interesting way. He says, well, reality is an agreement. Even at one point, Seth says in one of the Seth books, he's talking about the myths and the stories that we tell, and then the reality, but he says that the myth is the reality, the myth is the truth, that the meaning, that the structure of meaning that's going on and the way that we are modeling things is actually what's real. That's the most real. The apparent reality is just an expression of this this constant evolution of meaning that's going on. And in Carlos Castaneda, reality is an agreement. In The Leftovers, Damon Lindelof is a fan of Castaneda, I'm pretty sure. There's an explicit reference in his show Lost. But in The Leftovers, it's really the main character is following a very similar journey to the character in Carlos Castaneda's books. A lot of similar even scenes from the books. And Carlos Castaneda, actually, even though he's this kind of dismissed New Age author, he was actually referenced many times, as I said, in Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus. So there's an argument to be made that what people are calling metamodernism is just the metaphysics of our era, postmodernism, that's been wrongly kind of maligned as New Age, and New Age and postmodernism both get a bad rap because they are dealing with something that nobody really wants to address, that meaning is something that's not just a material practical survival tool that we add on to a world that has no meaning, because really that's kind of a Marxist modernist myth, right? That culture and meaning are just a superstructure, and the material world is really all that exists. Postmodernism is not Marxist in that sense, even though some of these guys embraced Marx, and what they're actually saying is not that different than what a lot of these spiritual or New Age metaphysicians are saying. You create your own reality sounds kind of silly if you don't dig into what Seth actually means by it. And I think Castaneda's reality as an agreement gets a little bit closer to the more academic postmodern philosophical viewpoint, and for good reason. Castaneda actually trained at UCLA under a Heidegger scholar for a time, so there's a direct lineage there. But if you really don't want to go into all this jargony academic cultural critique stuff, and you just want a good story that's going to address some of these issues, which are important, even if you don't care about all the theory. What is meaning? Is it just a cultural add-on to a material void with no real inherent meaning, or is the other way around? Is it, and not in the traditional idealistic, modern idealist sense of, well, there's this spirit that is, Hegel famously, the spirit is creating the material world. Everything is the evolution of this one idea, or of ideas that are, various versions of this. You still get in the New Age too, various master myths of the evolution of consciousness as being this kind of overarching development of either a single idea or ideas as expressions of this single spirit. In postmodernism, there's a shift, even though there is idealistic strains or strains that are similar to idealism. I think that the difference is the metaphysics of difference is different than this in that it's all about the relations. It's not about the idea itself. It's not about the spirit. It's about the spirit of relation. And so a truly relational metaphysics is something that we need, because it's what gets us away from fighting over what the truth is and getting over deciding how we want to construct it. Not that it's relative, not that it's just the creation of culture or of God or the spirit, but the spirit works through everything in cooperation to express and explore what things mean. Not that the truth is made up out of nowhere, but the truth is understood and expressed and explored through the conditions that we make in our relationships with each other being everyone, everything. We're all doing it together. And yes, in some sense, Seth and the movie might have everything everywhere all at once. But when we take things in their particular conditioned existence, then we have to decide. We have to create some kind of structure uh, with that infinity, and that is an adventure and a journey that The Leftovers, especially, I think, is great at showing. And the music is one of my favorite pieces of music by Max Richter. Every time that music kicks in, and it's funny because in the show, it'll be something really mundane. Damon Lindelof's writing is kind of strange sometimes, and the characters are saying something really kind of quirky. But when that music from Max Richter kicks in, it cues you into the profundity of what's going on. In a way, it manipulates you. Like, oh, this is actually really deep, even though it may not seem like it. But that's feeds into exactly what the show is about. That things can be very meaningful if they're invested with meaning, and that doesn't mean that it's just a product of the mind, but that by making connections to things, and music and emotion are what help us really, there's symbols and signs of emotion, of investment, of meaning. And just by their presence, just by the will or the motion to connect, it forms new connections. It forms meaning that wasn't there before, or in sense is there and was revealed and conditioned by our relations. This is a beautiful thing, and this is what we need to do more of in life. We need to be more willing to be creative with our meaning and connections, and not just argue about who's right and wrong. And we need more shows like this and movies, because media is really powerful in the way that it constructs and influences the way that we see everything, the way we relate to each other. So I hope you will watch it if you haven't. And thanks for listening.